I won't delay us any further. So we're on our final speaker for today, and I am absolutely delighted that through the beauty of technology, we've been able to bring Dr. Anna Minchom to our conference, because otherwise she wasn't able to attend. So that's great news. So Anna's going to talk about clinical trials, different aspects of it, and maybe touch on a little on the new Valent trial that she might be the senior investigator for. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over, I hope, by the power of magic, to Dr. Anna Minchom. And there she is! Thank you, Anna.
There in person. I've got childcare duties today, which I couldn't get out of, and I would much rather be in a room with you lot, but I'm not. I'm at home with my kids. But yeah, and so thanks, Debbie. As you say, I've been asked to speak on some clinical trials, and also to try and give, I guess, a kind of working guide to clinical trials and how to access trials if you'd like to, and sort of the pros and cons and nuts and bolts of clinical trials for ALK positive lung cancer in the UK. So I'm going to try and share my slides. Let's have a go. I think you won't be able to see my face when I'm sharing them, so please do butt in and interrupt if anything's going wrong with the technology. Back to the beginning. Okay, so those are my disclosures, and we've already discussed what I'm going to cover, so let's dive straight in. So I run a number of clinical trials in the UK, and the first thing to think about with clinical trials is what phase of clinical trial a particular trial is. Trials are often referred to as phase 1, phase 2 or phase 3 trials, and these are trials that span the whole of the process of drug development. And the development of a drug to treat cancer takes about a decade. A phase 1 trial is the first part of the clinical drug testing process. So before a trial, a drug is designed and tested in a laboratory, and that is tested in cancer cells, just in a posh petri dish really, or tested in some animal models, so mice usually. When that sort of preclinical part of testing is over, then a phase 1 trial starts, and most of the trials I run are phase 1 trials. Phase 1 trials are relatively small numbers of patients, so in the order of tens of patients, maybe 20, 50 or so. And the aims of that particular type of trial is to work out what the drug does in terms of side effects, and hoping to ultimately find the right dose to take forward for further testing. So, as you can imagine, this is quite an intensive process where safety has to be the absolute main key part of a trial, which means that for a participant taking part in a phase 1 trial, there's many appointments in hospital, lots of testing, including testing of the blood to find out what the drug levels are in the body. When these trials start, the first patient who goes on a phase 1 trial is going to go on a very small dose, a dose that's guaranteed to be safe. And then, when that patient's shown to be okay, some more patients are added, and that process continues with careful monitoring over the period of a phase 1 trial, with the dose increasing. So at the end, you've hoped to have found out what is exactly the right dose to be using. A phase 1 trial can take many months and short years. After the phase 1 trial, the trial will progress to a phase 2 trial. This is sometimes done pretty seamlessly within as part of the same protocol. So a unit will open a study that will be a phase 1 and a phase 2 study together. And the phase 2 trial is more groups of patients, can be in the order of hundreds of patients, and it's to look at the response rate. So that's obviously one of the most important things, is how well does the drug work. And you might have an indication of that from a phase 1 trial. If a drug's good enough, you will see some responses, but you're going to assess it in more detail in a phase 2 trial. A phase 2 trial can take, again, several years. And if a drug is past its phase 2 testing, so we looks like it's got a decent enough response rate, but it might be useful in patients, then a phase 3 trial might be done. A phase 3 trial is when the drug is compared to another drug, or sometimes compared to a placebo. So, the early ALK trials were comparing an ALK inhibitor compared to chemotherapy. Sometimes phase 3 trials aren't run because if a patient population, if a group of patients have a rare enough cancer, it's just simply not feasible to run a phase 3 trial, which has hundreds and hundreds of patients recruited to it. Whether or not a phase 3 trial is run, the ultimate aim to get to, hopefully, is that the drug is licensed and funded and available for patients if it works well enough. I think what's really important to think about, and I'm often asked this, is, well, I would like to take part in a trial. Do I take part in a phase 2 and a phase 3 and then a phase 1 and a phase 2 and then a phase 3? And the answer is no. So depending on what phase of a drug testing process a particular drug is at, depends on what's available at a time point. So it might be that at any one time there's just the phase 2 open or just the phase 1 open, and the patient participates in a certain part of that trial. Also important is, well, if I'm taking part in a phase 1 trial and a phase 1 trial shuts and a phase 2 opens, what happens to me and my drug? And the answer is, if a drug is working for somebody, then it's not ethically allowed to take that drug away from a patient. So if a patient's entered in a phase 1 trial and they're doing well on the drug and the trial shuts, as long as the trial hasn't shut for safety reasons, then the patient is guaranteed access to that drug. So, how do these trials get set up? There's two main organisations who are running a trial. The first is a sponsor, and a sponsor is often a drug company who owns the drug or has permission to use the drug. So, as Deborah mentioned, one of the trials we'll discuss later is the Nuvalent trial, and Nuvalent is just the name of a drug company. A sponsor is not always a drug company. Sometimes it's an academic institution. So that's a trial that has got funding, for example, from CRUK or a large grant funding. But for the most part, the sponsor is a drug company. Another term is a site. So a site in the UK is generally an NHS hospital. So the site I work for is the Royal Marsden. And the site is the organisation that treats the patients on the trial. I'm an investigator, so that means I'm a doctor employed by the site to run the trial. What the sponsor's doing is they are having overall responsibility for the trial, and they're providing the drug and they're providing funding to the site. So a drug company will enter into an arrangement with the site and provide the money for the site to run the trial. In return, the site needs to treat the patient safely and return to the sponsor information about the patients on the trial. So returns to the sponsor information about how well the patient is, what the side effects, how well their cancer is being treated with scan results, blood test results, and all of that. All of that data goes back anonymously, so the patient can never be identified by the drug company, but there's a huge wealth of hopefully high quality data that goes back to the sponsor, so that at the end of the study, the sponsor can amalgamate all that data and say, this is the right dose, is the drug working, what's the response rate, what are the side effects? Now, who is chosen as a site depends on what the site can offer. So it's a competitive process, and we try and be very competitive in the UK, but a sponsor will come and go around all the sites in the UK and say, well, quite a formal process. What can you bring to the study? Do you have all the necessary equipment and facilities on site to run the study? CT scans, all the usual stuff you'd expect. And as an investigator, have you got a track record to be able to run the trial and the experience to run the trial? However, some of that, even if you're a great site with lots of experience, sometimes you don't get the trials you want to run as a site. And that's because there's also a national factors at play. So is the UK competitive internationally? So a lot of these trials will come to multiple countries. The US, America is often the first port of call because they're very quick at opening studies. And actually, we work very hard in the UK as investigators to meet sponsors, to promote the UK as a great place to bring a research, because we really want to be able to bring high quality research into the UK. And it can be a little bit of an ongoing battle. So what about some specific trials for ALK positive lung cancer? Having treated some patients on trial, I know that you're probably all extremely well informed because every patient I've met has got a great in-depth knowledge of this trial. But I'm going to just tell you a little bit about this particular drug. I know you're a very expert audience, so forgive me if I'm repeating things in a too simplistic way. But this is how I explain ALK inhibitors to medical students and junior doctors. The ALK protein is a protein that sits on the cancer cell surface and sends signals through the cancer cell. That means the cancer cell grows quickly and behaves as a cancer cell rather than as a normal cell of a body. ALK targeting drugs bind to the ALK protein and stop that signaling process. But these drugs stop working eventually. And one of the reasons this happens is because there's a mutation that happens in the DNA that codes for the ALK protein. And the drug can no longer bind because the confirmation that the appearance of that ALK protein has changed. So a new generation of ALK inhibitors are being designed, which have the ability to bind both to the original ALK protein, but also to an ALK protein that's been changed in its makeup by a particular mutation. So ALCOVE-1, or Nuvalent trial, is a phase 1 and 2 trial of NVL-655 in advanced ALK positive non-small cell lung cancer and other tumours affected by ALK changes. And so you can see the map of this trial here, and it sort of gives a good example of that drug development process I mentioned in the early slide. The phase 1 portion of the trial is ongoing at the moment, and in that part of the trial, the dose is being increased from a very low dose of 15 milligrams, QD means once a day, up through a number of dose levels. When that phase 1 is being completed, and there will be a number of different safety reviews that go on to determine the right dose, and then a phase 2 will open. And the phase 2 is divided into a number of different cohorts. Cohorts are groups of patients. They haven't got the numbers in there, but these are relatively large cohorts with tens of patients in each. And you can see that ultimately we'll be testing in ALK lung cancer in patients who've had previous ALK inhibitors, and various different patients will be put in a different cohort depending on which ALK inhibitors they've had before. There's also a cohort there for which is a sort of a catch-all cohort to pick up patients who don't quite fit into those other cohorts, and for those with non-lung cancer ALK tumours. So information, data about the phase 1 will be coming out at some point, and I hope it won't be too much longer to wait. So we haven't got data in the public domain yet to talk about exactly what's being seen in the phase 1 so far in terms of response rates or tolerability. But some of the questions I'm often asked are, we know that this drug has, well, we know from testing in the laboratory that we'd expect it to have coverage of particular mutations that are found, such as the 4 that I've put on this slide. But one question I'm often asked is, do you need to have resistance mutations for the drug to work? The first part of the answer is we don't quite know yet, because this is early in the drug testing, and that sort of information we hope will be proven when we have got the information from the phase 1 and the phase 2. But in theory, no, the drug should cover the original ALK rearrangement, not just with the resistance mutation present. The second question I'm often asked is, will the drug definitely work if resistance mutations are present? And the answer is, we don't quite know yet, because we haven't completed the trial. However, there's unfortunately no definite these in drug development. We would expect it to work if resistance mutations are present, these particular mutations given in the slide. However, we do know that resistance to ALK inhibitors can be a really complex process, and there can be other factors at play, not just the particular mutations in ALK. So no, the drug will not definitely work if resistance mutations are present. Now, I would love this slide to be a really long one, but it's not, unfortunately. This is my slide on what other drugs are available in ALK positive lung cancer. There was another drug looking sort of similar to the Nuvalent drug that I had my eye on, called TPX0131, which is in phase 2 testing in the US. I looked this up when I was preparing this slide, and I was disappointed to note that that trial has been stopped, and it was described as having a not permissive or a not appropriate risk-benefit profile. So we don't really know what that means, but you would suspect that there was, low response rates and potential side effects. So I can't pick any other specific ALK inhibitors in clinical testing. However, there are many other drugs in clinical testing not specific to ALK lung cancer, but specific to lung cancer in general. And these include a large number of what are known as antibody-drug conjugates. These are compounds which have a small amount of chemotherapy attached to an antibody, and an antibody is a protein which has been designed to specifically target something sticking out the cancer cell surface, so a protein. So these are quite a new development of drug, and there's an awful lot of them around. In theory, they can deliver a chemotherapy dose directly to a cancer cell without side effects typical to chemotherapy. There are also the next generation of immunotherapies coming through to activate the immune system against cancer. So I suppose when I'm talking to patients about trials for ALK positive lung cancer, we talk about the ALK positive trials, and then we talk about this more general group of trials for lung cancer. And again, one of the questions I'm asked is, should I try and access an ALK specific trial option in preference to a non-ALK specific option? And the answer is probably, because we know from the experience of the last decades that an ALK specific option can have profound response rates compared to something like chemotherapy. However, it's really important to check each option individually. So, for example, this TPX0131 turned out to be a drug that was not going to be able to be taken forward for further development. So, and whereas some of the non-specific for ALK options are showing some really great promise and are coming out into phase 3 testing soon. So it's really important to check each option individually and look at what stage of a trial it's at, what the safety is, what's known about the side effects, and find out details about response rates. So a bit of a sanity check. The range of drugs in clinical testing is absolutely bewildering. There's only limited information and options available online. And that information is often not up to date, either because information about the drugs is not available, it's confidential, or because the information is not being updated in real time. So for example, there will be information on some of the websites about what sites are open, but that won't be up to date on a sort of week by week basis. And access to drugs is limited by the availability of trials. Also, many drugs that sound exciting are less so in reality. And so it's important, as I'll talk to you in a minute, about having those frank discussions about the people who are running the trials if you're thinking of participating. So how do you start to negotiate trial options? So I've got two parts to this. The first is a pathway of how a patient goes on to a clinical trial. And the second is how you actually get to a trial unit in the first place. So when a patient's referred to a clinical trial, the first stage is they're assessed by the research team. And that will generally be a face-to-face appointment, blood tests and ECG. Some of that can be done in advance with getting information from a referring doctor, but often a research team will actually like to meet, I certainly like to meet a person face-to-face. If at that appointment the patient is keen to go on trial after having had full information about the potential trials and is judged by the research team to be well enough to go on a trial, then they'll be allocated a slot. And that allocation really depends on what's available that week in the research unit. The patient's then given an information sheet. And in that information sheet is a huge amount of information about the trial. It talks about the sort of information that is already available, either from the testing of the laboratory or from trials that have been run before. But also, at that point, it's important that the researcher talks about information that might not be available in the public domain. So tells the patient the up-to-the-minute information about the trial. This is especially important on a phase 1 trial. So anything that I know as an investigator, a patient will know, including what number of patients have been on trial before, what side effects have been seen, and what responses have been seen. If a patient's happy with that, then their consent form is signed, and then they enter a period called screening. And screening generally takes a couple of weeks, and that includes assessment of extra tests. Some of these tests might have been done already at the first appointment, but some will be unique to the trial. So that might include echocardiograms, ultrasounds of the heart, and other specific tests. If a patient passes that, then they start on drug. And the screening procedure can be a bit frustrating because, as you can see, by that point, the patient's gone through an awful lot of time and energy and commitment to getting on with trial. So if something is found at screening that they can't go on, then that can be a very disappointing process. And a note on that, this is the sort of thing that you won't be able to see in advance when you're looking online. Some of it is available on something like clinicaltrials.gov, but a lot isn't. These inclusion criteria are specific to a trial. There are normally about 30 or 40 points which have to be met. Some are really similar. How well somebody is, if they're up and about every day, if they've got symptoms. Some are blood tests, so not too anemic, normal kidney and liver tests. Some are easily obtainable, so results available from previous ALK testing is one for ALK specific trials. Other ones include no active cancers, other than the cancer that's been treated on the trial. No recent blood clots, though anticoagulation is for the most part generally good and generally okay on trial. No other really major medical problems such as heart attacks and strokes or uncontrolled diabetes, and some drugs are not allowed on trial. Though to the most part, if any drugs are not allowed on trial because of interactions with a study drug, then alternatives can be suggested by the study team. So that's not normally a deal breaker in terms of going on a trial. So as you can see from this, most of this can be assessed up front, but sometimes some of this will emerge as a patient goes through the screening tests. Now, a note on waiting lists and slots. Especially for a phase 1, as I've mentioned, only small numbers of patients go on each trial. So generally it's about 3 to 6 patients go on trial. They're assessed for safety before the next group of patient goes on. Phase 2 is different. Phase 2 opens up and there should be slots for 30, 40 patients all available at once. But with these phase 1s, most trials are being run in many centres internationally. So you can have 50 or so sites across the world all wanting to get their patients on trial. So you find in a phase 1, when the cohort opens, there's a bit of argy-bargying to try and get your patients on trial. And so that's why there's often a waiting list kept. And the waiting list is kept by the site and then by the sponsor as well. And so the slots will get allocated by the sponsor. So I know this has been a feature for studies such as the Nevalent one, which we've mentioned already, that you're keeping a waiting list at site, but you will only get allocated a slot and be able to move down the waiting list when the sponsor allows it. Okay. So this all sounds incredibly complex, but I can assure you that many patients go on trial every day in the UK. And it is a tried and tested process that can be managed in a way that is hopefully of minimal stress to a patient. But when should you think about accessing a trial if you're interested in it? Generally when the cancer is growing. So most trials will say that a patient could only go on if the cancer is growing. And so in a way, there's not too much prep work that can be done when a cancer is stable, because options for trials change. So an option that might be available now may be totally different in 6 months' time or a year's time. So I would recommend not investigating clinical trials in too much detail until a cancer is showing signs of growth. Where can you access a clinical trial? Well, there's many centres in the UK who run clinical trials, and they're generally run by medical oncologists, so drug prescribing oncologists. There are networks that run more specific trials. So phase 1 trials are generally run in a network called the ECMC network. There are ECMC centres spread throughout the UK. So there should be one not too distant from most people. However, some trials are quite niche and are not run in many centres. And so generally for a trial, an investigator will not demand that a patient has to live too close to a hospital. If a patient is happy to travel to a centre, then they're welcome to travel. However, it's really important that a patient thinking about going into a trial has a look at the journey time and thinks, could I be doing that journeying on a regular basis? You know, if I had to travel that distance once a week or even twice a week, would that be something I really would want to take on? For trials, travel expenses are paid. It is demanded by the ethics committees in the UK and by sites that the drug companies fully fund travel expenses, and also fund overnight accommodation before, if a patient needs to come in early, for example, they've got a 9 o'clock start and they've got a 3-hour journey, they can come down the night before and stay in a local hotel. There are some nuances to that. So, for example, partners are often not funded if they're not staying directly with a patient. But there are also things like different access schemes for financial support within hospitals to try and help the logistics as much as possible. So how to access a trial? Really, oncologists should be able to guide and advise. There are sort of formal and informal networks of investigators in the UK. So your oncologist should have access to that network to know what trials are available. Of course, there's other sources of support and information, such as yourselves and advocacy groups. Really what is needed through the sources that you're accessing are detailed awarenesses of the options available in the UK. They change regularly, slot availability alters. Clinicaltrials.gov is every trial in the UK will be on that website, but it's tricky to navigate and needs local knowledge. It is okay to have a referral to a trials unit without having a trial in mind. And in fact, going in with an open mind, see what's on offer is possibly a good idea. And it's okay to have a referral to fact find about a trial, you know, without either knowing that you really want to do a trial at all or not knowing if you're ready for a trial. And most referrers will be happy to have that conversation and you know, give some information without any commitment at all to participating in anything. What should you be asking about a trial? So really, if you get as far as a research unit, you should come armed with really detailed questions to grill the investigator with. And a lot of these are quite obvious. How does a drug work? And why would you be expecting it to work in ALK positive lung cancer? What phase of a trial is it? How long has the trial been running? How many patients have been on trial? Have there been any safety concerns, especially any safety concerns that means the trial has had to be held for any reason? What's been a general experience of patients to date on the trial? And have any responses been seen? And what's the schedule of the visits? Logistically, what does it entail of going on trial? And that concludes. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to have any questions at all.